Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second section on angels in America. And we're going to be talking about gay identity, the gay community, and the body, and the intersection of these themes as they operate in Angels in America. We're going to talk a lot about Roy Cohn and Joe Pitt, the two Republican right-wing gay male characters who are in the closet, who do not openly and publicly acknowledge their homosexuality. And we're going to look at the identity issues surrounding these characters. Roy Cohn, of course, was a powerful, well-known historical person who was vocally homophobic and spoke out against gay rights. And his extreme right-wing viewpoints and history of political corruption make him the kind of person the LGBTQ community would generally despise. As such, he raises questions for the gay community about gay identity and gay community. And these are questions that Kushner was grappling with when he wrote this play in the 1990s. Questions about the limits of gay community. Who does it include and who does it exclude? This is a play about communities and membership in communities. And the play queries and critiques not just inclusion and exclusion within the identities of American, Mormon, Jew, but also inclusion and exclusion in the identity of homosexual. How does one define gay identity? Who is and is not gay, and who gets to make these definitions? Kushner has asked, and I quote, how broad, how embracing was our sense of community? Did it encompass an implacable foe like Roy? Was he one of us? Or to put it more specifically, how does a community that is constructed around shared identity, around the shared identity of homosexuality, around the identity of desiring persons of the same sex, deal with a person who has that shared form of desire, refuses the identity itself, and more extremely, demonizes and vilifies those who do identify that way? There's a term for a certain activity in the homosexual community called pink listing, which is about claiming or evoking historical people who were gay or who might have been gay if they could have been open about their sexual orientation during their era. This is usually done to celebrate gay history and create community pride. And it also provides role models and suggests a continuity of gay and lesbian presence over time and place across history. And note, I'm saying continuity of presence, not continuity of experience, as experience over time obviously has changed and changes. This is similar to feminists who find women in history who have been largely ignored and then write them back into history. So Roy Cohn, a powerful homosexual man, poses the question, can he be pink listed? And if so, how? Or to put the question in a more neutral way, where does Roy Cohn fit in a history of homosexuality? We can start by looking at how Kushner's Roy Cohn defines himself, specifically in the scene with his doctor when the doctor tells him he has AIDS. The scene opens up the politics of identity in fascinating ways. So I'm going to ask you to pause this recording now and then go watch the first video clip supplied. It's from the HBO Angels, and it's labeled Roy and the Doctor. Okay, so press pause, go watch that clip, and then come back here. Okay, now you've watched the clip, and we're going to talk about what you saw. So what we saw in that clip is the criteria Roy Cohen uses to determine identity and to organize people into categories. And his main criteria is power, or as he puts it, clout. Basically, whether you know people, have connections, and can make things happen. And Roy Cohen defines homosexuals as people who don't have clout. As he explains it in the play, homosexuals are men who, in 15 years of trying, cannot get a pissant anti-discrimination bill through city council. Homosexuals are men who know nobody and who nobody knows, who have zero clout. And how does he define himself? As a heterosexual who has sex with men. Roy Cohen is a heterosexual man who fucks around with guys. So, in Roy Cohen's view, homosexuality and heterosexuality are positions on a social hierarchy that measure power. He denies his homosexuality because, in his view, to be homosexual is to be powerless. And he has power. So, therefore, according to his logic, he can't be homosexual. So he reifies the homosexual as powerless in the sense that he makes it concrete and unchanging. He makes the immutable characteristic of homosexuality is powerlessness in his view. And of course, his position is a refusal to give or to allow homosexuals power. It's a refusal of the idea that they might or could have power. He won't say, I'm homosexual and I have power, therefore homosexuals can be powerful people. In his view, a homosexual who has power is simply a heterosexual who sleeps with men. As for powerful women who sleep with women, well, I don't think he is thinking about lesbians or other women at all. His position doesn't allow for the self-identified homosexual to have power or clout. In his view, they are mutually exclusive. And I want to make something clear here. Homosexuals in the 1990s were discriminated against, more so even than today. But they weren't completely powerless. Among the gay male community in the United States in the 1990s were many educated, articulate people who knew how to lobby and to organize in order to get public attention and resources dedicated to treating and researching AIDS, the disease that concerned them at this time. And although it was an arduous battle, the eventual successes in research, treatment, and education have a big debt to the efforts of those people. So I don't want, in our discussion of the AIDS crisis and how homophobia made that crisis worse, I don't want to reify homosexuals in the period as utterly powerless either. That community asserted some powerful agency and worked hard to make things happen. Okay, back to Roy Cohen and the play. Roy Cohen's definitions of homo and heterosexuality. And what's significant here is what doesn't define homosexuality. Desire and sex doesn't define homosexuality, as in who you have sex with. Those don't define it. The body doesn't define homosexuality. Roy defines body's desire to have sex with men, but he separates who he is from what his body desires and does, what acts it engages in. Sex and the body are irrelevant to identity in his view. But then his illness poses a challenge to him. With his illness, Cohen is up against the power of the body to assert itself. Since in the 1980s, AIDS in North America was mostly a disease of gay men. And still, Roy Cohen insists on the power to define his body and to name his body's functions and dysfunctions. And since Roy Cohen is not gay, Roy Cohen does not have AIDS. Roy Cohen has liver cancer. And this, by the way, is historically accurate. Roy Cohen did insist to his dying day that he had liver cancer. So what's interesting here, I think, it's interesting to think a little bit about Roy Cohen's choice of illness and what he sees as a respectable illness. Susan Sontag in 1977 wrote a short book called Illness as Metaphor, exploring how illness is spoken of and the myths and fantasies around certain illnesses and the way illnesses are used as metaphors in society. And she writes quite a bit about the stigma surrounding cancer, how the language surrounding cancer led to it being experienced as a kind of ruthless secret invasion, invisible until it's too late. It was considered a shameful disease, as though it were inner corruption made visible. And people were sometimes not told of their diagnosis. I mean, I think this is hard for us to wrap our heads around because cancer has become largely destigmatized. But cancer is still used as a metaphor for what is ruthless, implacable, and predatory. For, and I'm going to quote Sontag here, unregulated, abnormal, incoherent growth. The energy of which is, to quote again, an insult to the natural order. So I don't know, I can't help but think maybe Roy Cohen chose it because he thinks of himself as a kind of ruthless, implacable, and predatory person. Anyway, Sontag's thesis is that as a society, we need to think and speak neutrally about disease and not laden it with extraneous meaning and not use it as metaphors for other things. And not see it as reflecting something about the person who has it. And I mentioned earlier in an earlier lecture how TB used to be mythologized as a disease of creative, sensitive people. There are more negative connotations to the ideas surrounding cancer. Anyway, cancer is still used frequently as a metaphor, but its stigmatization was decreasing by the 80s. And for closeted men dying of AIDS, cancer became the respectable lie about what they were dying of. So Roy Cohen, with his so-called liver cancer, poses a problem for the homosexual community. How does a community constructed around shared identity, the shared identity of homosexuality, deal with a person who has that shared form of desire but refuses the identity itself and demonizes and vilifies those who identify as homosexual? And it is a conundrum, and it's mostly dealt with in part 2 of the play, which I didn't have you read. But I'm going to go ahead and tell you a bit about part 2 because it's important, and perhaps you'll go read it on your own or at least watch the HBO miniseries that I've taken clips from. So Roy ends up in Belize's ward in the hospital, and Belize, of course, is a registered nurse who is both gay and Black. And Roy can't hide his disease here. His body has outed him to this gay nurse. So as a result, Roy goes out of his way to antagonize him. And he says he wants a white nurse, and then he calls Belize a moron when Belize tries to give him a needle. But Belize is no lightweight, and he gives it right back to Roy and tells him he better not talk to him that way while he's got something sharp in his hands. and warns him that he can make the drip he's attaching feel like he's getting a liquid Drano injected, you know, that kind of thing. So they do not hit it off. But they have a really significant exchange. And here, I'm going to ask you again to put this video on pause and then go watch the second video clip, which is the exchange between Belize and Roy in the hospital. And I do apologize for the really poor quality of this clip, especially the sound, but I have written the dialogue out on slides 8, 9, and 10. So you can read those before or afterwards. Okay, so press pause, go watch the video, and then come back. Okay, so what you saw was that Belize does Roy a favor, a huge favor. He gives Roy this life-extending advice that he's gathered in his intersectional identity as a nurse and as a gay man who knows many other gay men who've had AIDS. And he tells him, don't let the doctors radiate the sarcoma lesions because it will kill his T cells, which are an essential part of the immune system for fighting infection. Basically, treating this symptom of AIDS, these cancerous lesions, will make the AIDS worse. And secondly, he has noticed that Roy has gotten in on a test for the experimental drug AZT. And he tells Roy to make sure he is not being given the placebo because he will die. He has very little time, and getting the actual AZT drugs is the only hope he has. Roy, of course, knows that Belize has no reason to like him, and thus we get the final exchange in the scene. And I'm going to read these words, although they are offensive. You hate me, Belize says. Yes. Roy, why are you telling me this? I wish I knew. Roy, you're a Butterfinger spook faggot nurse. I think you have little reason to want to help me. And then Belize says, consider it solidarity, one faggot to another. So the dynamics of the scene are fascinating. There's this contest here between these two powerful opponents. And I would venture to say that Belize wins this contest. He wins by forcing Roy to think of himself as like Belize, as sharing an identity with Belize. Roy tries to push him off, tries to insult him so deeply that there can be no alliance of any kind between them. But Belize doesn't take that bait. One faggot to another, he says. I'm in solidarity with you because you are gay. And with that, he forces an identity onto Roy that is defined by the homosexual body. What we also see in this scene is Roy being forced to rethink his political ideas about medical knowledge. He can't quite believe that a gay black nurse might have more knowledge than a white doctor, and that, you know, homosexuality could actually be a politically powerful identity, as particularly when it comes to circulating knowledge about AIDS that can result in effective treatment. But he is forced to recognize this, and he gets himself his own private supply of AZT so that he's not getting the placebo. So this is part of how Kushner explores his themes of identity. And we see some of that exploration again later when Roy Cohn dies in the hospital. And this is still in part 2. After Cohn dies, Belize calls in Lewis because he needs Lewis for 2 things. Belize is going to steal some of that huge stash of AZT that Cohen has in his own private little fridge in his room, and he's going to steal it in order to give it to people like Pryor who need those pills. But he needs somebody to smuggle the pills out of the hospital. So he wants Lewis to do that, but he also wants Lewis, who is Jewish, to say the Kaddish over Roy's body. The Kaddish is a Jewish prayer for the dead. It's in Aramaic, which is an ancient biblical language. It's actually the language Jesus spoke. And Lewis, who is a secular Jew who was never even bar mitzvahed, definitely does not know the words to the prayer. But then what happens is the ghost of Ethel Rosenberg appears and she speaks them. Lewis doesn't see the ghost, nor does Belize, but by some miracle with Ethel Rosenberg there, speaking them, Lewis is given the words. They come to him. So they say this prayer over Roy Cohen's body. So what is staged for us to see is this momentary community that is forged based on their shared Jewishness across political divides, despite deep political differences. Ethel Rosenberg and Lewis, of course, both hate Roy Cohen. Now, Kushner is, on the one hand, he's suspicious of the assumed and automatic solidarity and commonality between people of the same race or religion or sexual orientation. But he doesn't reject it completely. He seems to be exploring what bonds or bridges can be made between people who hold entirely different values, but share one of those factors of identity and can be, one of those factors that can be a major part of one's identity, like religion, race, or sexual orientation. Of course, it's also significant what they say after the prayer. Both Ethel and Lewis end it with, "You son of a bitch." So there are limits to inclusion and acceptance. So we have inclusion, but an ambivalent inclusion of Roy Cohen, the political enemy, into the community of gay men, and an ambivalent acknowledgement by Ethel Rosenberg and Lewis of their shared Jewishness with Roy Cohen. Hang on. But even more than that, I think what Kushner is doing here is creating an acknowledgement of shared humanness. And it's Belize's idea to say the prayer over Roy's body. And he says that they're going to do this, they're going to say this prayer in order to thank him for the pills. And when Lewis protests about the idea of praying over this terrible man, Belize says he would pray over anyone, even someone who was terrible, even Lewis, and that Roy died a hard death, as though from a human perspective that should be acknowledged. And he evokes forgiveness and the difficulty of forgiveness. He says love and justice meet at forgiveness. That justice on its own would be harsh and incomplete without love to lead it to forgiveness. Okay. And so he says there, a queen can forgive her vanquished foe. It isn't easy. It doesn't count if it's easy. It's the hardest thing, forgiveness, which is maybe where love and justice finally meet. Peace, at least. Isn't that what the Kaddish asks for? And Lewis' response is, oh, it's Hebrew. Who knows what it's asking? So there's also a little joke here in that Lewis knows so little about this prayer that he thinks it's in Hebrew. And it's also kind of funny that Belize, who gets angry at Lewis on several occasions for making sweeping overly generalized statements about African Americans somehow assumes that Lewis will know this prayer just because he is Jewish, even though he is such a secular Jew that he doesn't even know what language the prayer is in, but believes, he calls him, and he says that he calls him because he, quotes, needed a Jew. So everyone is capable of making assumptions, and Kushner's having a little joke here. Okay, so I want to go back to part one, which you actually have read, and I want to look a little bit at the conflict between Belize and Lewis as it gets to issues of identity based on the body. So in a coffee shop, Lewis goes on this long political rant that gets Belize more and more angry, because Lou basically denies that race is important in American ideas about American identity. And this can be, it's quite dense, and it can be hard to parse what Lewis is talking about. And I'm skipping some of it, but I'm just going to read a bit here, and then we'll talk about that. So Lewis says, the thing about America is, I think, is that ultimately we're different from every other nation on earth in that with people here of every race, ultimately what defines us isn't race, but politics. Not like any European country where there's an insurmountable fact of a kind of racial or ethnic monopoly or monolith, like all Dutchmen. I mean, Dutch people are, well, Dutch. But here, the monolith is missing. Oh, I mean, of course, I suppose there's the monolith of white America, white straight male America, Belize says, which is not unimpressive, even among monoliths. Lewis says, well, no, but when the race thing gets taken care of, and I don't mean to minimize how major it is. I mean, I know it is. This is really, really an incredibly racist country, but it's like, well, the British, I mean, all those blue-eyed pink people, it's the racial destiny of the Brits that matters to them, not their political destiny. Whereas in America, so basically what Lewis is saying here is that the difference between the US and other countries is that the US is racially and ethnically diverse, whereas other countries are homogeneous. They have ethnic or racial monoliths. And he concludes from this that, therefore, race is not an important factor in American identity as it is in for example, British identity. Because American identity has to be composed of something other than race, since there are so many Americans of a variety of races and a variety of religions. Whereas, as Lewis states it, Brits, for example, are all white and Christian, and possibly even mostly blue-eyed. Well, there are several problems with Lewis's analysis here. Firstly, these other countries are not as homogeneous as Lew claims. I mean, Britain, for example, has many citizens of African, Caribbean, and South Asian descent. And the many civil wars that have happened, for example, in Eastern Europe and Africa, are testament to how many of these countries are not racially, ethnically, and religiously homogeneous, even if they may seem so to outsiders who don't understand those countries. And I mean, if you think about Rwanda and Burundi in the former Yugoslavia, these are places with significant ethnic divisions that may not be visible to people who just from outside. And secondly, and perhaps even more significantly, what Lewis says trivializes the significance of the place of race in American struggles over what is American identity. We see this still today. We especially see this today when nationalist movements in the US, we see it with these nationalist movements as they cohere around the idea of making the US a great nation again, but in many cases, they are very closely aligned with the white supremacy movements. And the idea of making the US a great nation is aligned with an idea of Americanness as being white. So in Belize's view, Lewis is papering over how contentious racial difference is in the US. So they have this exchange. Belize says, here in America, race doesn't count. Lewis says, no, that's not. I mean, you can't be hearing that. Lewis says, look, race, yes, ultimately, but race here is a political question, right? Racists just try to use race here as a tool in a political struggle. It's not really about race. There are no angels in America, no spiritual past, no racial past. There's only the political and the decoys and the ploys to maneuver around the inescapable battle of politics, the shifting downwards and outwards of political power to the people. So Lewis says that he's not denying that the US has big problems with racism, but he thinks those problems aren't really about race, that race is a ploy that is used in political maneuverings. That racists don't really care about racial difference. What they care about is power, and that racial difference can be leveraged to gain political power. One can, for example, one can gain political power by disparaging or discriminating against certain races. And that's why racism exists. So he denies that racial, ethnic, religion, or even animosity over gender identity and sexuality is ever primary or real. He suggests that people just use those differences to put other people down and gain more power for themselves. Now, he's not entirely wrong. Racial differences can be leveraged as a tool in political struggles, and they often are. But he is sweeping over a lot, including the existence of belief in white supremacy and the practices of systemic racism that affect people of color every day. And interestingly, what Lewis is doing in denying the significance of race to ideas about American identity is denying the significance of the body, is denying that the body itself is part of what creates identity. Lewis insists that the fight over American identity is a fight over politics, that the fight over whose politics are going to define American identity, that's what the fight is. The fight is over whose politics are going to define American identity, that it's not a fight over whose body is going to define American identity. It's not about which body that looks a certain way and has certain desires is going to stand for what it is to be American. So it's a denial of the politics of the body and an insistence that the real differences between people are political and that they are about who has power. And of course, we've seen this before, just now actually, in the character of Roy Cohn, who sees all struggles and all identities in terms of power, and who sees people belonging to identity categories according to how much power they have. These are the only categories he has, really. And he separates who he is from what his body desires and does. In his view, his body is irrelevant to identity, and all that is relevant is how much political power he has. Belize, on the other hand, despite all the animosity he feels towards Roy, can't help but identify with him enough as a fellow gay man to give him crucial advice about his medical treatment. Who the body makes you is something Belize acknowledges. He knows that his gay body and his black-skinned body influence who he is, what his identity is, what his place is, and how much power he has in the United States. Okay, that's the end of the first part of lecture 2, and we will move on shortly to the next final section.